Well, folks, we're ready to begin with our keynote speaker who is going to take on this theme. And we have, everybody says you have the perfect keynote, but we really do. So I just think I'll say that. We have Dr. Natalie Hopkinson, who is the Associate Professor in the Department of Communications, Culture, and Media Studies at the Cathy Hughes School of Communications here at Howard University. Now, her bio is rich and long, so I'm going to just pull out a few kernels for you. I will tell you that you can also find her a short, tight bio in the program as well. First, I'd like to talk about what her work focuses on. Her work focuses on questions about the arts, history, gender, culture, and media. And she blends her scholarship with public advocacy. That's very important to keep track of. Second, she's a prolific scholar. She's up to book 4 and counting chapters, and she is she regularly publishes essays in publications like the New York Times. I was looking at the Huffington Post and the Slate. So she is, her scholarship is both in the traditional places we find for scholars, but also is made available to the public at large. Third, she was her work as a co-founder of the Don't Mute DC movement. Wow. Influenced the legislation to make go-go the official music of Washington, DC. So this is an example, it's only one example of many, of her public advocacy. And I guess I have to go to the 4th. I just have to put this one in because more recently, Mayor Bowser appointed her to the Commission on Arts and Humanities. And when you hear her remarks and her presentation, you will understand how important her voice is on that commission. So, Dr. Hopkinson.
Thank you so much, Associate Provost Dark, and all the organizers of this wonderful conference. I love this title, Uncomfortable Conversations. I feel like I was born having uncomfortable conversations. And so I think I've just been waiting my whole life to sort of be here and kind of talk about some of them. So I actually have a few slides that I will share as I'm going. So what I'd like to talk about today are the racial debts in the humanities. And the Don't Mute DC situation could be another awkward conversation. Maybe we'll talk about that another time. But today there are 3 other awkward conversations that are sort of swirling around in the atmosphere that I think are teachable moments, and opportunities for us to really engage with our history, with the human experience in this country and the way that they connect to our cultural institutions. So the first awkward conversation that I'd like to start with is this one. Maybe you heard that there was a little interview that happened a little while ago done by Oprah Winfrey. It's this nice, beautiful young couple. They announced they're, expecting their 2nd child. It's a girl. I found it absolutely fascinating, and as a media scholar, it's an opportunity to sort of look at what the discourse is, the public discourse is. How are people grappling with conversations that are this heavy? I mean, when you're talking about the monarchy, you're talking about centuries of structures of power and culture. And so how are people dealing with it? So a lot of us media and cultural scholars, we go to the tweets to see how folks are dealing with it. So we will move to the first tweet. that I saw about this. This is from Adam Rothman. He's a historian at Georgetown, wonderful scholar. He said that monarchy and racism are cut from the same cloth, a hereditary right to rule. I thought that was a pretty powerful insight that he made. And the next tweet that I'll highlight is from Sarah Brown. She's an attorney in the UK. And she said, here's the thing. Americans are obsessed with race. They were in the 90s when I studied in Chicago, and they still are. Understandably, perhaps, in the context of their own history. But here in the UK, we are not, and thank God, right? So this was sort of her take. And that was sort of fun thing about Twitter, is that you could see these hot takes from across the pond, as we say. This was a pretty amazing statement. I sort of looked at it, this quote, and felt a bit of disbelief. Both my parents are from a place called British Guyana, and that their history is not intertwined with race is definitely news to me. But I did think that it was very useful. This comment was very useful because it is actually something that's very common. As Associate Provost Dark mentioned, these conversations can be ugly, they can be uncomfortable and unpleasant, and people would just rather not have it. And so, but because of this, because of the history, of the body I'm in and the world that I'm and my children are inheriting, I have really tried to lean into these conversations that people don't have, and to put sound back into the silences that are around our history. When we do that, we can gain so much knowledge of ourselves, as individuals, as our cultures, as our society. It allows us to understand our past so that we can have a better handle on our future. And sitting with that discomfort in our classrooms, in our research, in our reading list, all of this will help us prepare for a new global reality that's really here. And so from there, I'd like to move to my second awkward conversation. And it's sort of like, this is also about me sort of grappling with this sort of history. And this is about, staying with the British theme, this was a chapter in my last book, A Mouth is Always Muzzled, called Booker Prize. And I opened this chapter with an extremely uncomfortable conversation that was started by this gentleman here. John Berger is a novelist, art critic, brilliant scholar and writer, who was one of the first recipients of the Booker Prize for literature, which was meant to be the most prestigious prize in English letters. And he won this, he won the award for this novel called G. And when he was asked about what he planned to do after winning this award, which came with a £5,000 prize, this is what he said. He said, "This prize is given by Bookers, Booker McConnell, who are a firm with extensive trading interests in the Caribbean for 130 years. The extreme poverty is the direct consequence of exploitation of companies like Booker's and others. And so I intend, as a revolutionary writer, to share this prize with the people in and from the Caribbean who are involved in the struggle to resist such exploitation and eventually to expropriate companies like Booker. I'm actually going to give half of my prize to the London-based Black Panther movement." So this was a pretty bold statement. He's really, and definitely awkward. I'm sure there was a whole lot of awkward silence in that room. The speech was actually televised by the BBC. Talk about biting the hand that feeds you. However, as I learned in my own research, he had a point. So what I did was I actually looked at the history of Booker, the two brothers from the UK who went to Guyana when Guyana was, the British Empire had ended slavery. They had voted to end slavery 1834, and they compensated slave owners. I call it a ransom, 20 million pounds they paid to compensate the owners, in order for them to liberate their enslaved people. And so the Booker brothers really were able to use that bit of money, as it was a great infusion of cash for what would be an empire that lasted, as he said, 130 years, right until 1972. The London-based Booker McConnell Company, at that point, in 1972, they were still drawing 45% of their profits from Guyana, which was one of the poorest countries, in the Western hemisphere. It sort of often alternates with other countries in the Western hemisphere, but it's a very poor country financially. And so not only was Berger right, I was able to document how right and count exactly how right he was. And so, so I really, will always salute John Berger for really leaning into having that awkward conversation. So the next awkward conversation that I'd like to bring up, I've just been totally obsessed with this, that this happened in the last year. I lived in Indianapolis for a while as a child, and so I know about some of these cultural institutions. At the beginning of this program, it was so beautiful hearing Lift Every Voice and Sing, the Black National Anthem. I learned that song when I was a child in Indianapolis, going to the Walker Theater, which is a historic Black theater. And so anyway, I have a real affection for Indianapolis and its cultural institutions. So this awkward moment came last year during the height of the George Floyd protests in July of 2020. This is a curator named Dr. Kelly Morgan, who had been one of the only Black curators at the museum, decided that she had had enough. She found the workplace toxic. She found her work in trying to uplift Black narratives nearly impossible. And she wrote a very nice long treatise in the Indianapolis Recorder, which is the local Black newspaper, historically Black newspaper. And what she said was that if white folks and governments will not do what it takes to dismantle white supremacy once and for all, we will tear it all down. Like clockwork, racist monuments have been dropping like flies ever since. And although I hate to say it, museums need to be next up on this list. So this was awkward in Indianapolis, very awkward, sort of let a lot of tongues wagging. I really do encourage people to read her whole essay that she wrote, because she really goes into the roots of white supremacy and the way that European values and art forms are uplifted, and the way that other perspectives are suppressed. And it's just absolutely brilliant. But when she did do this conversation, they really didn't lead to much change until about 6 months later, and this was just last month, the head of the museum decided to put out this job ad for a new director of the museum. And, in this job description, it said, programming opportunities, blah, 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 innovative ways that attract broader and more diverse audiences while maintaining the museum's traditional core white art audience. So this was part of the job description in hiring the director of the museum, of the Indianapolis Museum of Art. They need somebody who can maintain the traditional core white art audience, right? So there it is, just out in front of everyone. So that was the thing that actually ended up sparking a lot of outrage, and the head of the museum resigned and all these other things. But, it's unfortunate that people didn't listen to Dr. Morgan. And people really weren't ready to hear what she was saying. And I'm hoping that the larger lesson for more arts and cultural institution is to listen to what she's saying. But, I think as awkward as that conversation is about the culture of the museum world and how there are these hierarchies, where you do have the security and food staff who tend to be Black, and everybody at the top who tends to be white, right? The ways that they sort of make everyday individual people feel not as welcome, right? In some of these institutional settings. And so those are like awkward conversations that sort of continue the way the curriculum is, the way way the canon is, how they uplift certain traditions and suppress other traditions. But one really important awkward conversation I think that must be had in the humanities is just the math of it all. So I mentioned before that, my mother was actually the business manager at the Madam C.J. Walker Theater in Indianapolis. This image of it in the front is on the right. It was created by Madam Walker, who was she was a entrepreneur. She's known as one of the first Black women millionaires. And as a patron of the arts, she established this theater in the 1920s. And then you have the Indianapolis Museum of Art, which is supported mostly by the Eli Lilly endowment, which is, these are the pharmaceutical giants. And so, but you look at the disparities between the way that Black philanthropy can support Black focused subjects, and then the way that white dominant philanthropy, the scale of the disparities in how these institutions are supported are pretty important to talk about. 2018 income for the Indianapolis Museum of Art, 16 million. The same for right down the street, a few miles away, Walker Theater, 2018 income is 482,000. So those are also, I think, important conversations to have about the way those disparities are, how these cultural divides are economic divides too, even in the humanities. So I want to go back to the Booker Prize because it does have a postscript that happened last year during the George Floyd protests. So when I published my book, and my book was published in 2018, where I talked about the Booker Prize and I talked about my research about this family and how the pillaging of my parents' country where they were born, where that sort of like details that with receipts, with numbers and receipts. I published an excerpt in the New York Times, that drew a lot of attention. People were really surprised. People did not know about this history. People didn't understand that that's where the Booker Prize came from. I got some good critical response, but I wouldn't say it was a bestseller or anything, but it generated a few conversations. But then it wasn't until the George Floyd protests happened 2 years later when all of a sudden people started picking up on the conversation. And somebody from the Booker Prize actually reached out to me and they said, "We saw your article when it came out in the New York Times and we grappled with whether we should put out a statement. We actually have more details about John Berger's speech, or whether we should just not say anything about it." And so they had elected to just not say anything about it and, sort of like ignore your problems and they go away. But after George Floyd protests took over the world, people started thinking critically about people like these institutions, these cultural institutions, and where did they get their money from? And so there were calls to the Booker Prize, which has changed. It has evolved. It's not supported by the Booker Company anymore. A lot of other things have happened in Guyana the company actually was put out of Guyana in the 70s. But there were calls for people to change the name. When people learned that Booker was these were these exploiters, these racial exploiters, people thought, well, we probably should just go ahead and change the name. And so that's when they called me and they said, well, what do you think? And my feeling about it was that absolutely not. Do not change the name. sit with the name, remember the name, talk about the name. Before I did my research, my parents who had grown up in Guyana, they knew Booker is just the company that owned everything in Guyana, right? They didn't know this history at all. And, it's really an opportunity to go ahead and just lean into the history, talk about the history, deal with it. And if you want to make some sort of reparations for it, then, I said, by all means, because there was talk about scholarship or something like that, I said, by all means, just go to Guyana and ask them what they want. Don't set up some prize judged in the UK. So we had a nice long conversation about what they can do about it. So we had the conversation, but then I haven't heard anything else. So I don't know whether they're ready for it or not, but I'm really grateful that at least doing the research and kind of engaging it and putting it into a public forum, that was part of the way that we were able to start to have a conversation about it. So in the last few minutes, I want to talk a little bit about some ways forward and some of the work that I'm doing about how I'm grappling with this history and thinking about how to translate that into work that I do in my department of Communication, Culture, and Media Studies. As Associate Provost Dark mentioned, I was one of the co-founders of the Don't Mute DC movement. It has led to not only making go-go the official music, it also has led to a lot of opportunities to continue to create structures that will support music that had been silenced in the era of gentrification. And so one project is Traditional Arts DC. And it's a project, we're still sort of getting it started and conceptualizing it in partnership with the National Endowment for the Arts and the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities. And I really think about it as we really need theoretical interventions to decolonize these Eurocentric frameworks in the arts. And Dr. Kelly Morgan, her treatise, it actually gave some very specific ways to think about dislodging this white supremacy that we are finding in these cultural institutions. And I think by starting a project right from the beginning with this anti-colonial decolonizing framework, we have an opportunity to sort of bake it into the way that we're doing. So this is a vehicle to conduct field research and cultural programming. It centers Chocolate City history, DC's Chocolate City history, and art as a way of life. It's really sort of connected to a history of African diasporic traditions that shape the arts globally. And it's also a spectrum that includes Native American traditions, of course, go-go music, which is what the Don't Mute DC movement was about, fashion, foodways, dance, and even such traditions as Black Greek rituals that you'll find at Howard University. As Dr. Moffat is also mentioned, she's also part of that tradition with her membership, I think with the Deltas, please correct me if I did that wrong. So these are important traditions, right, that did not originate in Europe. They originated here and other parts of the world. And so from the beginning, we're really thinking about how we center them, how we shape what stories are remembered, what stories are documented, what art forms are preserved. And we're teaching students in rooting them in those frameworks. So the other awkward conversation that even within that work that we're trying to do with this program that I'm working on is, again, thinking about these racial debts that have not been paid. These, what was really fascinating to me about the story about the Booker family, there are scholars like Hilary Beckles in particular at the University of West Indies. He wrote a book called Britain's Black Debt. And he really talked about how the Booker family were just one of many families in the UK that really used this money, this infusion of cash at the end of slavery to make this transition into an industrial economy, but also support these institutions in the UK. Churches, schools, museums, this money is still there and it's still being there and it's still being hoarded and it's still sort of replicating these hierarchies that we're talking about. And, you know, so this is something that we can even see here in DC, you know, in disparities between Howard University and Georgetown University. So I had a friend a few years ago who was, she was adjunct teaching at Georgetown and Howard, and she was sort of complaining about Howard. And she said that, you know, when I was at Georgetown, they gave me my office, you know, I had my dedicated phone line, you know, it had all these, you know, amazing facilities. And I said, you know what? That's what happens. That's the difference between an institution that was created to support enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, and another institution that was actually maintained by selling enslaved people, right? So those disparities are still with us today, right? So I don't feel a way about, I mean, of course I want more resources and Howard needs more resources desperately. And that's part of the racial debt that needs to be paid is Howard to get the resources that it needs to really do this work. But I don't feel bad about it. Like, I don't feel like I'm responsible for that disparity that's still there. Howard's endowment, this is just a rough estimate, you know, just around 700 million. Georgetown, twice that, right? So these are legacies of this history that we don't want to talk about and that it's impolite to talk about. And so what I want to close with is that, you know, sort of some of the implications for higher education. We have to lean into these conversations, as awkward as it could be, and as uncomfortable and as unpleasant as it might be. You know, I think it's really important to have them. And there's the conversation, and then there's also the math, though, right? So I think it's important to count these debts, to truly account for them, and to be able to make people whole. So we don't have to capitulate to the amnesia and the silences. These aren't just uncomfortable for the majority of our world, but they're violent. These silences are very violent. To remember the savagery of what is happening to Black people across the globe is to acknowledge the layers and layers, the deep historical roots of these inequalities that brought us here. It means remembering racism that is baked into each American brick in this country and each British brick, you know, as I'll point out, the racism that infects each stream that we drink from, it's in every drop of air that we breathe. So remembering this, we have to remember it, but remembering also means you need to pull out a calculator to count the debts that keep racking up and finding that checkbook and finding ways to pay them. So that is the conclusion of my remarks. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for all the work that everyone is doing at this conference to make this all less awkward.
And if you all would join me in thanking her for those wonderful and insightful, and I love the stories. They're powerful. Now, this is something that probably rarely happens in a conference. We are ahead of schedule. Feel it, okay? Because it doesn't happen. We've got about 3-4 minutes here, and I'm just wondering, Dr. Hopkinson, if you would be willing to, you know, field a question or two.
Of course.
So what I would say to those of you, we are not taking the questions from the chat, but what you can do, and I'm now trying to see if I can see the view, I can, is use your electronic hand. Now you can find your electronic hand if you roll down to the bottom and click reactions. You'll see you have an electronic hand that you can raise, and then we'll recognize you. So question, comment? Very good. Dr. Jones, you can go ahead.
Hi, this has been wonderful. You got me thinking a lot. I wanted to know, in places where power is oppressive and these uncomfortable conversations can be, like you said, silence is violent, but in places where you even try to raise conversation and you can get outed or pushed out, do you have strategies or tips on how to even begin these conversations in a way that, I guess, still protect you?
So I think that is, so the title of my book was A Mouth is Always Muzzled, and it was from a poem. A mouth is always muzzled by the food it eats to live. And so this is a reality that every human being, not just artists, lives with, is that a mouth is always muzzled because we have to eat. And if you risk getting put out, so what John Berger did was really powerful, because maybe he doesn't get invited to the cocktail party ever again, and maybe he doesn't, so it's a lot of risks that are involved. And I find a lot of strength from people who overcome that and are able to speak anyway. One thing that I find it is useful is if you ground it in sort of evidence and history, right? So this isn't personal. These are just facts. Booker went into the country, they controlled the country, they dominated the country for 130 years, and it's one of the poorest countries in the West, right? These are just facts, right? So, and it's not like, it's not about attacking. So this woman who thinks that, oh, we're not, the Americans are obsessed with race, the British aren't. It's not about attacking. It's just like, well, there is this whole history here. Let's talk about it, and so that's what's one of the good things about the humanities. It can have these racist and unequal structures, but it also can be the vehicle to be able to engage with it and have conversations about it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have room for one more. Kate O'Brien.
Thank you. This is a wonderful conversation, and thank you so much for everybody who's organizing it. I'm really excited and really appreciated your presentation, and the part that was newer for me, let's just put it that way, was also the talk of receipts and being able to use your calculator, right? I work at a university in Pittsburgh that didn't maybe necessarily have enslaved people, but definitely treated their neighbors in the historically Black neighborhoods poorly, and we're trying to start to reckon with that right now. And so the part about the receipts and so on is really interesting and engaging for me. I just wonder, where do we start when it comes to something that's not as clear cut as slavery, but more nuanced?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the question. So my former classmate at Howard, Ta-Nehisi Coates, when he wrote The Case for Reparations, that was what was very significant about what he did, was he did not start with slavery. He talked about segregation. He talked about predatory lending and how the way the real estate market was very predatory in the period after desegregation. And those are slavery's afterlives, right? Racial segregation that we're still living with. You can still count those receipts right now. We are in a profoundly segregated society. It's shown in our housing patterns, our school patterns around schools, work, pretty much every way you can count. We are in a separate and unequal society. And so those are still receipts that we're still generating them today. And so I think those are good places to begin conversations as well.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you
and
very much.
I'll look into that book.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. And again, thank you, Dr. Hopkinson, for an outstanding presentation and wonderful framing and getting us off to on the right track in this discussion. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Okay, One of the other pieces of the way we organize this conference is that, of course, we have a lot of faculty on panels and who will be presenting. And so the faculty voice is definitely here. But we really also felt, if you've got the faculty voice, it's equally important to have that student voice. In fact, one would argue more important to have our student voice. And so we have student presentations built into the program throughout the day. Our first student presentation will be by Hydia Riley. And Hydia Riley is class of 2021, woo woo, okay, and a senior majoring in English and minor in photography. Hydia Riley, special presentation.
Good morning. Today I'll be presenting a poem by Margaret Walker titled For My People. For my people everywhere, singing their slave songs repeatedly, their dirges and their ditties and their blues and jubilees, praying their prayers nightly to an unknown God, bending their knees humbly to an unseen power. For my people lending their strength to the years, the gone years and the now years and the maybe years, washing, ironing, cooking, scrubbing, sewing, mending, hoeing, plowing, digging, planting, pruning, patching, dragging along, never gaining, never reaping, never knowing, and never understanding. For my playmates in the clay and dust and sand of Alabama backyards, playing, baptizing, and preaching, and doctor, and jail, and soldier, and school, and mama, and cooking, and playhouse, and concert, and store, and hair, and Miss Chumbi and company. For the cramped, bewildered years we went to school to learn, to know the reasons why, and the answers to, and the people who, and the places where, and the days when, in memory of the bitter hours when we discovered we were Black and poor and small and different, and nobody cared, and nobody wondered, and nobody understood. For the boys and girls who grew in spite of these things to be men and women, to laugh and dance and sing and play and drink their wine and religion and success, to marry their playmates and bear children and then die of consumption and anemia and lynching. For my people thronging 47th Street in Chicago and Lenox Avenue in New York and Rampart Street in New Orleans, lost, disinherited, dispossessed, and happy people filling the cabarets and taverns and other people's pockets and needing bread and shoes and milk and land and money and something all our own. For my people walking blindly, spreading joy, losing time, being lazy, sleeping when hungry, shouting when burdened, drinking when hopeless, tied and shackled, and tangled among ourselves by the unseen creatures who tower over us omnisciently and laugh. For my people blundering and groping and floundering in the dark of churches and schools and clubs and societies, associations and councils and committees and conventions, distressed and disturbed and deceived and devoured by money-hungry, glory-craving leeches, preyed on by facile force of state and fad and novelty, by false prophet and holy believer. For my people standing, staring, trying to fashion a better way from confusion, from hypocrisy and misunderstanding, trying to fashion a world that will hold all the people, all the faces, all the Adams and Eves and their countless generations. Let a new earth rise, let another world be born, let a bloody peace be written in the sky, let a second generation full of courage issue forth, let a people loving freedom come to growth, let a beauty full of healing and a strength of final clenching be the pulsing in our spirits and our blood. Let the martial songs be written, let the dirges disappear, let a race of men now rise and take control. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Whoa, let's give her a round of applause. For my people. That's a very powerful selection. Thank you very much. We really appreciate it. You have started us off really wonderfully. Thank you. And also in advance, congratulations on your upcoming graduation.